Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Isis and this is Isis Says Hi. I like to make a lot of YouTube videos about topics that matter to me. I learned that I was holding the mic wrong. Also, I decided to add clips, to create clips from the video, from the last video. I'll link it up somewhere. Fully forgot to link it back to the full video. So did a great job there, but from what I was able to see and from the reception of the last video, I'm just really happy and grateful because I wasn't expecting all of that, and it was really nice to get, especially delving back in. I just wanted to thank you all. I got so many nice comments. A weird comment, I think somebody thought I was like 16. I'm not. I'm 28. Very much the opposite of 16. As you can tell by the video, the top of it, today we're going to be talking about Ronald Reagan. A heads up, I do not like Ronald Reagan in any capacity. If he doesn't have any haters left, I'm dead. Because of the state of our world today, a lot of things kind of like the foundations of a lot of the failures in our systems, in the US systems anyways, it contributes directly to Reagan's era, Reagan's administration. So I wanted to figure out, my God, what did he do? How many things did he do outside of what I know? And I want to let you guys know as well. Let's hope I finish this in a decent amount of time. I bought lobster rolls from a food truck. I really hope that that's not a bad decision. They seem fire. They seem fire. Oh, you want to see my cats? Let's show you the cats first and then we'll get into it. All right, cat number 1, Frankie. Hey, you're so cute. Cat number 2, Willow. Willow. Yeah, that sounds about right. Anyways, let's go into talking about Mr. Ronald Reagan. So I decided to go not from like high school. That's a lot of work. Like, where did he first hold like a really public leadership position? And the first one was in the Screen Actors Guild. Ronald Reagan began his deep involvement with the Screen Actors Guild in the late 1940s. His first engagement with the guild came as he attended his first board meeting as an alternate for Heather Angel. His then wife, actress Jane Wyman, also joined the board a year later. World War II had temporarily halted his participation, but then he resumed as a board alternate in February 1946, 1 month before my grandma was born. Rest in peace to a beautiful lady. Oh my God, no. He was an alternate for Rex Ingram and then Boris Karloff. In September 1946, Reagan was elected the third vice president, impressing the board of directors during the often violent Conference of Studio Unions strikes. I'm assuming this is kind of similar to a lot of the actor strikes that kind of happened over the years, or just like studio strikes that have happened over the years for studio workers. But I wasn't able to really find a lot on this strike, so I'm a little confused by that one. Because of how he acted during those strikes, he was able to get the presidency within 6 months. And then March 10th, 1947, at the board meeting, Reagan was elected SAG president, which is also Screen Actors Guild, and he came after Robert Montgomery. His initial presidency had spanned from 1947 to 1952, and there he focused on issues such as negotiating the Guild's first entirely new contract since 1937, addressing the implications of the labor weakening Taft-Hartley Act. From what I was able to find, the act kind of required union productions to report the hiring of non-union members. And then as soon as the people gained union eligibility, the performer then had 30 days to work union or non-union before having to join the union itself. And then if they didn't join a union, then the union production would be penalized for hiring them if they were not part of a union or part of the overall union. So I guess it was labor weakening in that a lot of non-union members had to join a union, and probably in those times the unions were pretty racist probably. So the fact that the production was now going to be penalized for not making sure that the members were within the union probably was labor weakening. I'm a little confused by that because to me it's, you have to report that somebody's not in a union, and you hire them. And then as soon as they're eligible, you do have to make sure that they're part of the union or that they are in a union, or else you're still going to be penalized because you're hiring somebody that's not within the union. And I guess maybe that just meant that that was like a lot less work for actors who maybe were not eligible or weren't in the union, but I don't know. It was a little confusing with that one. And then also handling the House Committee on Un-American Activities hearings during the Blacklist era, because America was in their big anti-communism bag, you know what I'm saying? So they held about 9 days of hearings into the alleged communist propaganda that Hollywood was delving out. It's kind of crazy how much America really hates communism. I hope I explained that well, but I don't know. I've always been like, you guys really hate communism for a country that is not really good at being equitable at any capacity. His tenure also included managing the severe decline in Hollywood film production, which was caused by the rising popularity of television. During this period, he fought for television residuals for actors, ensuring they received ongoing compensation for their work as television became more prevalent. Residuals are payments that actors get when TV shows or films are rerun and released in new formats. Reagan returned to lead SAG in 1959 during another period. This was marked by a lot of intense negotiations with movie studios over residuals for films shown on television. When Reagan began the SAG negotiations, the movie studios did not want to discuss residuals. In 1960, because of that stalling in negotiations, Reagan authorized a strike demanding those residuals, and they were joined by the Writers Guild of America. And that led to a 5-week work stoppage, and that brought Hollywood to a standstill. Sound familiar? So fun. Why can't you just pay people their money? Like, what is so difficult? You have enough. The strike was successful, securing residual payments for films produced after 1960, and this saw a really significant moment of solidarity between actors and writers because of the Writers Guild of America joining them on the strike. And I'm pretty sure that's like pretty normal now. We saw with the strike before, but then also the most recent Screen Actors Guild strike, actor strike, and then also them being joined by the Writers Guild of America. This time though, a lot of y'all did cross the picket line, and that's sad. Couldn't be me. To go more into the deal that they were able to secure, the actors were able to get residual payments for films that produced after 1960. They didn't get residuals for movies that were made before 1948. The studios also gave $2.65 million to establish SAG's first pension plan. The agreement was pretty approved by a lot of social I don't know why I said social. A lot of SAG members did approve it, but there were a lot because they were, they wanted to go back to work, and that was really significant for Reagan, getting that much people on his side. But some folks were like, I feel like if you tried a little harder, you also could have probably gotten residuals for movies made before 1960. And I agree. The deal also helped with the Writers Guild of America when they were doing their negotiations as well. So more on the critiques about Reagan. He was not crazy well liked back in that time because he was an actor and a producer. I think now that isn't really a big deal as it was back then, because they found it to be really conflict of interest-y with him being at the helm of the negotiations with studios. Fellow SAG official and actor James Garner criticized... If you can't hear it, my cat is licking the leather chair. Willow's looking at him too. All right, thank you. Fellow SAG official and actor James Garner criticized Reagan's leadership in his memoir, saying that he lacked originality and relied heavily on others for direction. And there was perception that Reagan had also caved under pressure from MCA. That was the company that represented him. He also made a joke later on saying that negotiating with Mikhail Gorbachev, who we'll talk about a little later, over arms reduction was easier than negotiating with studio heads. That sounds so cringe. Something I didn't know was that Reagan was like a pretty liberal Democrat for a while. Why is it that hippies just become conservative out of nowhere? I do not understand. He actually really loved President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose New Deal provided jobs for his father and his brother during the Great Depression. His families were Democrats, and I guess they lived in a really highly Republican area. And Ronald Reagan was a Democrat. And although he never lost his admiration for FDR, he became became like pretty conservative and switched his registration to Republican in 1962. Him changing his political ideology was influenced by a lot of different factors. The first one, he was getting richer and he wasn't a fan of the higher taxes because of it. Second thing was that he just kept fighting with a lot of more liberal union members when he was president of SAG and within SAG. I was about to say SCAG, scallywag. And then when he was doing ads or like working with General Electric, he kind of was more exposed to the federal government. Also his wife, his new wife, no longer Jane, Nancy Davis, who I thought was his only wife. I didn't know that he had an ex-wife. His wife and then his conservative father-in-law also influenced him a lot. By 1962, he had formally switched political parties, and in 1964, he campaigned for Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater. Reagan announced his candidacy for governor of California in 1966. He was against the incumbent Democrat Edmund G. Pat Brown. He had been already governor for 2 terms and he was running for a 3rd. Pat Brown had mocked Reagan for his lack of political experience, pointing to his acting career, particularly one film called Bedtime for Bonzo. What a crazy name. But because of that, Reagan was actually able to use that to his advantage, positioned himself as a political outsider, fed up with government inefficiency and overreach, which I feel like a lot of I need to speak slower. I feel like a lot of politicians also call themselves that when they're trying to get elected, like they're a political outsider and they're gonna change the government. This isn't new. The game hasn't changed. He blamed Brown for a lot of the concerns over race riots and the student protests at UC Berkeley. Like, I don't know why he keeps licking the chair like that. He blamed the rising taxes and promised fiscal responsibility, limited government, and welfare reform. His charisma, his friendliness, and humor also resonated with voters. There was one example of when he was asked by a reporter how he would perform in office. He replied, "I don't know. I never played governor." There was another part of the governorship while he was, trying to get elected. He actually had gotten a huge part of the labor vote during his first run. More and more as he kind of went into politics, he distanced himself a lot more from the labor places. His election was also backed by a lot of wealthy Southern Californian entrepreneurs headed by auto dealer Holmes Tuttle, and encouraged by Nancy Reagan. Reagan secured the governorship with a nearly 1 million vote margin. Reagan opposed all civil rights measures, that's not surprising, and any governmental attempts to alleviate poverty. He just said that was more of a personal decision and relationship thing. That's not public policy. You guys just gotta deal with racism and poverty on your own. Are you insane? During his time, I think mostly when he was as president, the colorblind age really leaned in, really was in its bag. This new era claimed equal opportunity, but the equal opportunity wasn't really equal. And in dealing with the burgeoning anti-war student protests at the University of California, and the way he responded to it was to clean up the mess there. He also got Angela Davis fired. I forgot to put that in there, but he did. He, of course, got elected governor, and during his terms as governor, he erased a lot of the budget deficit that was inherited from the Brown administration through a lot of spending cuts and government efficiency initiatives, and the largest tax increase in California's history. I believe it was also just in the whole of the United States history as well. He signed the California Environmental Quality Act, which is a law that's criticized by Republicans for slowing and halting a lot of new building projects. And he also signed a bill that expanded access to abortions, which is a decision he said he later regretted. Additionally, he was very, he took a stance against anti-war and student protests, deploying the National Guard in 1969, famously declaring, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with." He worked with Democrats to pass welfare and property tax reforms and protected the wild rivers of the state's north coast. His successes in office solidified his reputation as a capable leader and propelled him into national politics. The way that he would be a governor was the way that he would also be president. He left a lot of the details and day-to-day government business things to his assistants and department heads, and he decided to focus on like the bigger picture because it gives him an excuse to not really be blamed for a lot of the decisions that are made. He also had a rigid schedule. His aides would prepare and type up for him daily, which is ironic because that was a criticism that he kind of got from when he was president in SAG. During his second term, he reformed a lot of the state's welfare system to reduce the number of people receiving state aid while improving benefits for those who remained eligible. Reagan sought the presidency in 1968, and that was boosted by his success in California, but his candidacy had divided his followers and a lot of national conservatives. Some wanted him to run for president, but others were like, I think you need to wait a little bit longer before you do that. And so, trying to please both sides, he ran a half-hearted campaign. Then he tried again in 1980, and he won his party's nomination and then won the national election, defeating the incumbent President Jimmy Carter. Before Reagan took office, the American public was already growing a lot more skeptical about the government and politicians. This was exacerbated by the lies told by Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon about the Vietnam War, Nixon's Watergate scandal, and then President Jimmy Carter's inability to deal with the twin problems of rising prices and unemployment, which is called stagflation. The first run of him really stepping into his president bag was January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan had scoffed at mythical female welfare cheats on the campaign trail, again revisited from when he was running for governor in 1966, and he continued to use throughout his presidency. So he was elected president November 4th, 1980. His triumph really showed the rise of the new right and the conservative wing of the Republican Party and ushered in a new era of governing. He was arguably the first actual conservative U.S. president in over 50 years. Accompanying the Reagan era was the rise of a well-oiled, corporate-funded conservative propaganda machine, and this was all designed to really lessen activist government and glorify a lot more unregulated markets. In his inaugural speech, he linked the government to national decline. He declared that the economic crisis of the 1970s was proportionate to the intervention and intrusion in our lives that result from unnecessary and excessive growth of government. The voter turnout also reflected this new conservative rise. Only 52% of eligible voters went to the polls in 1980, which was the lowest turnout for a presidential election since 1948. Those who had cast a ballot were usually older, whiter, and wealthier than those who did not vote, and the strong support among the white voters, those over 45 and those with incomes over 50,000, proved crucial for Reagan's victory. So you had a lot of domestic policies that included lessening a lot of the federal government's responsibility to solve social problems, reducing restrictions on businesses, and implementing tax cuts. Reagan embraced the theory of supply-side economics, feeling that the tax cuts would encourage economic expansion. I don't think he actually believed that, by the way. And that would increase federal government revenue at a lower tax rate. Higher revenues would then increase defense spending and balance the federal budget. This overall approach became known as Reaganomics, but Republican primary candidate and Vice President George H.W. Bush called it voodoo economics. During his first year in office, Reagan engineered the passage of $39 billion in budget cuts into law and a massive 25% tax cut spread over 3 years for individuals and faster write-offs for business capital investments. At the same time, he insisted on, and for the most part, successfully gained increased funding for defense. Again, why do we need so much defense funding? Like, what's going on there, besties? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? He also vowed to protect specific programs, which were Medicare and Social Security, while cutting budgets for other social programs. Reagan also led the battle for Social Security reform, and there was a bill that was designed to ensure the system's long-term longevity, and oversaw the passage of immigration reform legislation and the expansion of the Medicare program to protect the elderly and disabled against catastrophic health costs. Reagan also had a lot of new justices. He elevated William Rehnquist to promoted him to the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And then he appointed Anthony Kennedy, Antonin Scalia, and Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman, to the Supreme Court. Part of the right's kind of fundamental beliefs was that judicial activism was unconstitutional and that judges should be selected based on an adherence to quote-unquote judicial restraint. Essentially, they just didn't want them to care as much, ruling on the livelihoods of millions of people. He was not popular with a lot of marginalized groups. That's not shocking. In 1986, over 30% of the Black population had an income below the official poverty level, and many labor leaders disliked Reagan, especially after he fired air traffic controllers when they refused to end their strike. I'm pretty sure that's illegal now, but that was insane. Republican politicians, I should say, are pretty anti-union, even though a lot of their fans are part of a union or are union members. That is always funny to me. Reagan's administration also saw a rollback of civil rights protections and a reduction in the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, and that affected a lot of the progress made by marginalized groups in previous decades. He also made a lot of comments about welfare queens, perpetuated harmful stereotypes about Black women, and contributed to the stigmatization of folks who received welfare, and that further marginalized a lot of the communities. He also encouraged the development of private sectors, so taking some of what the federal government was in charge of and moving that into a private sector, because he thought that it would be better served by private businesses or state or local government. As the president called for international cooperation to stop the influx of illegal drugs, especially cocaine, U.S. First Lady Nancy Reagan led the campaign against drug abuse, urging the nation's youth to just say no. I'm hoping that I can find that egg commercial.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
I get angry just thinking about it. Makes me mad. Little kids doing drugs, it turns my stomach. That stuff hurts. It stops you from living up to your potential. It holds you back. It hurts the user. It hurts his family. And it hurts his friends. I just want to shake some sense into you kids that are using drugs and thinking about using it. So remember, don't, or else. Okay?
He also signed the Depository Institutions Act in 1982 and oversaw a lot of significant changes in the nation's savings and loan industry. This law allowed a lot of this, it's called S&L for short, but it allowed them to move away from offering home mortgages and let banks provide adjustable rate mortgage loans. As a result, S&Ls entered a period of intense real estate speculation, poor management, and fraud. For nearly a decade, the industry saw a lot of mergers with banks and S&Ls buying each other and making a lot of loans for projects like shopping malls, golf courses, office buildings, and condos. And these loans were often made without sound financial reasoning and also were usually using the money that people had put into the banks. A lot of it was just driven by a desire for quick profits, probably to pay back the loans that they took out. By the late 1980s, a lot of these S&Ls and banks had failed, leaving behind billions of dollars in bad loans. The federal government had to step in and bail out the depositors whose money had been misused, and that cost over $130 billion. His indifference to marginalized communities was legendary. Early in his presidency, this was so bad. Early in his presidency, at a White House reception, Reagan greeted the only Black member of his cabinet, Housing and Urban Development Secretary Samuel Pierce, saying,
"How are you, Mr. Mayor? I'm glad to meet you. How are things in your city?"
You literally choose your cabinet as president. How are you not gonna know? I'm so concerned. That was the worst thing I ever read. Not only did he fail to recognize who was in his cabinet, he also failed to deal with the growing... Also, why is it that white presidents just immediately put Black people in HUD? What's going on? And that's housing and urban development. It feels a little racist-y. Like, especially like when Ben Carson, a doctor, was put in charge of HUD. I was like, not only did he fail to recognize somebody from his cabinet, he also failed to deal with the growing corruption at the HUD agency. It resulted in the indictment and conviction of a lot of Reagan administration officials for illegally targeting housing subsidies to politically connected developers. Pierce and others rigged the allocation of subsidies for housing projects to favor Reagan's campaign contributors. So essentially they were giving a lot of the projects and housing subsidies from HUD to anybody who favored Reagan or donated to him. Very much illegal. And one of those folks were former Interior Secretary James Watt. Luckily for Reagan, they didn't discover that scandal until he had left office, so he got lucky. But not the people who were part of that scandal, even though he really should have also been found guilty, but whatever. The president who can't even recognize his own cabinet, and not only that, but allows his cabinet to make such wildly illegal decisions. Even though he didn't really invent that pay-to-play game or the revolving door of top government officials becoming well-paid lobbyists and government contractors, he didn't really start that kind of culture. Him being so hands-off with like the details of each of the departments really allowed that pay-to-play and government and that revolving door to really increase and led to a lot of corruption. The 1980s also had a lot of racial discrimination by banks, real estate agents, and landlords, unmonitored by the Reagan administration. The community groups uncovered a lot of redlining by banks, so a lot of racial discrimination, but Reagan's HUD and Department of Justice did not prosecute them or sanction banks that violated the Community Reinvestment Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in lending. Also, there were a lot of declining fiscal fortunes in America's cities during the Reagan years. By the end of his second term, federal assistance to local governments had been slashed by 60%, and he had also eliminated a lot of revenue sharing in cities, and he cut funding for a lot of public service jobs and job training, and almost dismantled federally funded legal services for people experiencing poverty, and reduced funds for public transit. When I tell you this man hated marginalized communities, he really did. He put his foot on it. The most dramatic cut in domestic spending during Reagan's years was low-income housing subsidies. In his first year, he cut the budget for public housing and Section 8 rent subsidies in half. Congress had also thwarted his plan to eliminate federal housing assistance to people experiencing poverty, but he got a lot of what he wanted regardless. In the 1980s, the proportion of eligible impoverished people who received federal housing subsidies also declined a lot. There was just a lot of attacks on social programs that included a lot of mental health institutions, any drug programs, anything like that that actually helped people, slashed. Reagan conservatives were finally able to begin dismantling the New Deal state and Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. In 1981 and 1982, Reagan made more than 22 billion cuts to social welfare programs, including federal student loans and the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which was a program that paid businesses to train and hire folks who were economically disadvantaged. The federal deficit grew as Mr. Reagan had cut taxes, ironically enough, and accelerated military spending. And that inherited a national debt of about $995 billion, which is nearly tripling it. Then when a 3-year recession hit in 1980, 6 million more Americans fell into poverty, and by 1989, employment had recovered, but there was a very weak social safety net, and that meant workers were an illness or accident away from hardship, and we still are. And then Black people became the poster children for the perceived threats that drugs and welfare posed on our nation, from Reagan's 1981 Economic Recovery Tax Act, which cut benefits to vulnerable families and children, to his escalation of the war on drugs in 1982. Reagan placed Black people and communities in his crosshairs. Black poverty, homelessness, and incarceration skyrocketed, and the progress that the civil rights movement ushered in, the Reagan Revolution ushered right on out. Reagan is widely credited for dramatically slashing taxes, which he did. By the time he left office, the top marginal tax rate had dropped from 70% to 28%, which is insane. Only being taxed 28% and you're like rich as hell. Insane. He also changed the Republican Party storyline. Previously, it had been the party of sound money and a balanced budget, but he made it to a party of tax cuts. And Reagan also significantly increased the federal workforce during his 2 terms in office. The number of federal employees shot up from 324,000 to 5.3 million. And Mother Jones reports that in 2012, there were nearly 1 million fewer government employees than in the final year of Reagan's presidency. We're gonna break. I went to go get lobster from the food truck. It wasn't bad. Tacos were like, amazing. And the tots, 10 out of 10. I also got this is a lobster bisque. Oh, also, I got cold. A normal occurrence for me. Also, wait a minute. It was like a freak rainstorm. I pulled up to the food truck, raining so hard. I run out as much as I can anyways. Pick up my food. I go back in the car. The rain stopped completely. What is that? That's insane. We were at Reagan's international policies, so let's get back to it. So internationally, Reagan is anti-communism. So he was a fierce opposition to the spread of communism. He had a strong distrust of the Soviet Union. He labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983, and he had championed a strong, rearmed military and significantly supported the MX missile system in the Strategic Defense Initiative, which I'm pretty sure is like actually terrible, and that's why they nicknamed it the Star Wars program. I swear if y'all start fighting. So a lot of the actions that he had done to show how much he just hated communism, let me tell you. He gave a lot of financial and military support, had like a military support of the Contras, and that was against the communist Nicaraguan government. And then there was aid given to the government of El Salvador. And then the US also invaded Grenada when the nation was perceived as falling under Cuban domination. They supported the UNITA, which were anti-communist fighters in the Angolan Civil War involving Cuban proxy troops, and the support given to rebels fighting Soviet forces in Afghanistan. These efforts were named the Reagan Doctrine. Words are crazy today. While efforts for peace in Central America faltered, the Soviets announced the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan in 1988, and the Angola conflict was successfully negotiated with the withdrawal of the Cuban troops. Reagan believed that the nation could negotiate with the Soviet Union from a position of strength. To show that strength, they had done a lot of modernization, which included the production of an intercontinental missile. The increase in military spending and the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union at the beginning of Reagan's second term opened a new era of relations between the two superpowers. And after several meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev, the two men signed the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty at the Washington Summit, December 1987. This agreement promised to eliminate an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles and was the first arms control agreement in history to reduce the nuclear arsenal. That just got wasted a lot of money, but anyways. In addition, the administration began the Strategic Arms Reduction Talk, and that would reduce the strategic nuclear arsenals by 50%. That included large multiple warhead missiles. When pro-US dictators in Haiti and the Philippines appeared on the verge of being toppled from power, Reagan engineered their safe removal from their countries, ensuring bloodless coups and a new government, which he hoped would be friendly to the US. In the Middle East, Reagan reported in his inaugural address that the 52 American hostages held in Iran for 444 days were at that moment being released and would soon return to freedom. He also maintained a firm stance against terrorism, exemplified by the US retaliating against Libya for an air attack in 1981 and again in 1986 for the death of Americans in a Berlin discotheque. Reagan's peacekeeping force in war-torn Lebanon experienced tragedy in 1983 when a truck bomb killed 241 soldiers. Tragedy struck again in 1987 when a missile from an Iraqi warplane killed 37 sailors aboard the USS Stark, part of a US naval task force that had been sent to the Persian Gulf to keep that waterway open during the Iran-Iraq War. The darkest hour would be the Iran-Contra affair. The review board reported that Reagan authorized the sale of arms to Iran in exchange for helping to free U.S. hostages in Lebanon. The investigations revealed that the money gained from the arms sale was illegally diverted to aid the Contras, opponents of the Nicaraguan Sandinista government. The congressional report criticized Reagan for his detached, hands-off style of management. In the aftermath of the affair, National Security Advisors Robert McFarlane, John Poindexter, as well as National Security Council aide Colonel Oliver North were indicted by a federal grand jury and convicted of various charges regarding the Iran-Contra operations. So they kind of embezzled. A little embezzlement. They were pardoned. President George H.W. Bush pardoned McFarlane, and Poindexter and North's convictions were set aside on appeal for technical political reasons. This is a weird one. I still don't understand the point of this one. But in 1986, Reagan granted amnesty to 3 million undocumented immigrants, selling it as a crackdown that would increase border security in addition to bringing people out of the shadows. The bill's enforcement mechanisms were stripped mainly to ensure it passed, and it was widely considered unsuccessful in reforming the immigration system. It was so confusing to me when I read that because I was like, okay, great that you pardoned them, but like that's not really gonna allow you to be this enforcer that you're claiming to be because you're pardoning them. So okay, they come out and they're like, okay, well, I was pardoned. You can't really deport them, right? Because they were pardoned. I'm so confused by that. That was just like a weird blip that I still don't fully understand. Even though he had warned about the dangers of big government, he created a new cabinet level agency, which is the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the number of federal employees increased during his time in office. If you didn't know, the Department of Veterans Affairs, they really barely actually help veterans. And then he also agreed to a compromise with Democrats in Congress for a $165 billion injection of funds to save Social Security. By the late 1980s, middle-class incomes were barely higher than a decade ago, and the poverty rate had risen. Although Reagan reduced the economic regulation that began under President Jimmy Carter and eliminated a lot of price controls on oil and natural gas and long-distance telephone services and cable television, that deregulation during the Reagan administration contributed to the savings and loan crisis. So when banks were just buying and borrowing and building things for a quick profit, and also led to the economic collapse of 2008. Funnily enough, which I could have sworn there was actually no record of President Reagan using the phrase trickle down. His economic philosophy was closely aligned with the idea that business-friendly policies would ultimately benefit the entire economy. By reducing taxes on the wealthy, Reagan, quote-unquote, hoped that the benefits would trickle down through increased employment and business activity. Reagan hoped to incentivize economic activity and reduce dependence on the government by reducing government spending and taxes and making it easier to do business. These policies garnered reduced inflation, lower unemployment, and an entrepreneurial revolution that became synonymous with the 1980s, and many low-income and marginalized communities did not see improvements in their financial situations. For instance, during the Reagan presidency, the minimum wage was frozen at $3.35 an hour, and that failed to keep up with inflation and the eroded and the standard of living for a lot of low-wage workers. Because economic growth was slower than expected, he still actually had a lot more federal spending than he had intended. The individual tax brackets were indexed for inflation, and a lot of people experiencing poverty were exempt from the individual income tax. The rate of new business formation had increased sharply, but bank failures were the highest since the 30s, and actual interest rates did increase a lot, but inflation-adjusted prices of common stocks more than doubled. Many Americans credit Reagan with reducing the size of government. He increased government spending, cut taxes, and turned the United States from a creditor to a debtor nation. That's crazy. He escalated the military budget during his presidency while slashing funds to domestic programs that assisted working class Americans. He also slashed funds and policies that protected consumers and the environment, so protected buyers. Both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush followed in Reagan's footsteps. Reagan's fans credit him with restoring the nation's prosperity. Whatever economic growth occurred during the Reagan years primarily benefited those well off. Again, there was that widening income gap between the rich and everyone else in America. The number of people who were in the federal poverty line rose from 26.1 million to 32.7 million. By the end of the 1980s, the wealthiest 1% of Americans had 39% of the nation's wealth. These cutbacks affected cities with high poverty levels and limited property tax bases, of which depended on federal aid to provide essential services because there was less federal aid for property tax. Usually that's like streets, roads, like the street lights, stuff like that. The consequences devastated a lot of city schools and libraries, hospitals, clinics, sanitation, police, and fire departments, a lot of which had to shut their doors. Also, a lot of mental health institutions as well. Many cities still haven't really recovered from that downward spiral. Another of Reagan's enduring legacies is the steep increase in the number of homeless folks, which had gone from 600,000 to 1.2 million. A lot of them were Vietnam veterans, children, and laid-off workers. But that is the end of this this video. Thank you for watching. I didn't realize how much I had written on Reagan until I sat down to record it. And I hope you all have an amazing rest of your week, day, whatever. Reagan sucks. I'm sorry if you love that man. Anyways, I'll see you all later. Bye!